Young people face a myriad of issues in contemporary Australia, from chronic levels of unemployment and underemployment, rapid rises in cost of housing and cost of living, and now the social and economic hardships unleashed by the pandemic. However, many young Australians, like myself, do not expect charity or handouts from our leaders. We simply ask that the promise of a fair go made to our parents and grandparents extend to us as well. Does the panel believe that current policy settings are enough to address the challenges that are facing and will face my generation?
Colin Barnett.
Well, I think for the baby boomer generation, I agree with Kerry's comment. It has been a prosperous and safe time for most of the baby boomers. For the younger generation, I think most of us of my age are more concerned about the life facing our children and particularly our grandchildren. It is going to be a lot more difficult. All sorts of issues are arising almost on an annual basis. But I think our policy settings are pretty good. And let's face it, Australia, despite the COVID crisis, is a good place to be as Australia. And I think we've got a lot to be confident in the future. So I don't have a huge problem. I realise there are issues that some people feel intensely about. But I think if you look across the board, Australia has been well governed, and I believe it will continue to be well governed.
What then are the policies that the boomer generation, Colin, have sacrificed for younger generations that are struggling now to buy a home, to pay back their HECS debt? What are the sacrifices?
Well, I don't think the baby boomers have had to sacrifice much at all. I mean, and most baby boomers are really healthy, as you can expect for age. Most of them own a home, most of them have superannuation and the like. So for most people, it's a pretty good older age as it approaches. For younger people, it is going to be more difficult to own a home, and maybe to some extent the aspirations is above what is reality. In the 50s and 60s, most young couples went out and bought a flat or an old home and did it up. Now, those opportunities aren't really there for many. Also, my generation had job security for most people. Young people today are going to have multiple changes of career, occupation and the like, and that's going to be challenging. So I think the baby boomers are stepping back, smelling the roses a little bit and wanting to see good policies, sensible policies that are compassionate and are fair to all, as the questioner said. We do need fairness and equality and an egalitarian society, and I think Australia is in a good place.
Do you agree, Kerry?
I don't think Australia is as egalitarian as we'd like to think at all. When I've read credible studies which tell me that Australia was a more equal society when I was a kid than today. And I know that Indigenous Australians would have cause to disagree with that because in many ways they didn't exist in those times officially. And Mabo hadn't happened, and there would have been no Indigenous person going through a university. But nonetheless, today you have a situation where poverty is increasing year by year in Australia, one of the most prosperous societies on the face of the earth, where 3.24 million Australians are living in poverty, where 775,000 children are living in poverty, where those figures are increasing, both in terms of percentage as well as in real numbers, where young people, according to the latest Productivity Commission report, and this is a government agency, the Productivity Commission, that under 35-year-olds' wages have been going backwards for the last 10 years. Now, these are just a few of the instances of the growing inequality, which I don't believe is sustainable if we want to have a cohesive society and a civil society. And we're already, I think, starting to see the polarisation and the breakdowns that are manifestly evident in the United States that has given us Donald Trump. And Donald Trump wouldn't be existing, he wouldn't be in the White House if it wasn't for those millions of disaffected people in America.
Do you think we're on that trajectory?
I think we are. I think we are now a polarising society. Our politics are polarised. But the real fundamental failure in this country is a failure to have provided continuous quality leadership. I feel very strongly about it. I think our two-party system is letting us down. And both sides have to step up and face the responsibility for that. And I could go on, Hamish.
I'm sorry to
Well, it's so refreshing to hear you, Kerry, because I think you're 100% right. I think that we, you know, I see this every single day. In the last 5 months during COVID, there was gross inequality between how funds were distributed, how food was distributed, how people were affected through this pandemic. And it is absolutely symbolic of our society. We have to shift and change. And our leadership has to shift and change and take responsibility.
But where has the leadership been lacking during this? Because we've had premiers standing up, we've had at a federal level our leaders standing up, listening to the science, chipping in with the funding where necessary. Why do you think the leadership has been lacking?
Because first of all, it took them time to react. That's number one. Number two, with the funding, if we hadn't lobbied for the sector that I represent, and
you're talking about the charity sector.
I'm talking about the charity sector, the essential services sector, there was not going to be funding for us. How come a sector that employs 1.3 million people, provides 8% of the GDP, had to fight to get a handout as opposed to equal distribution of funding? So I think our leaders that are now squabbling between premiers, this is the time for them to actually come together and lead our country out of this crisis together, strongly, or within this crisis, rather than infighting.
Ray, do you think leadership's been lacking during this pandemic?
Oh, most definitely, even before the pandemic, because for Indigenous Australians, we feel like we've been taken back on the old mission. I'm a product of the old mission, one of the last of the mission blacks. And so I know what it was like before the 1967 referendum, and I've seen the progress that we have made, but also the incredible things that have been taken from us in terms of our advancement. And I guess we should be, Indigenous Australians should be a measuring stick of our ways forward. We'd love to be part of the boomer cohorts and have that kind of opportunity to retire with that. But you'll see in our communities that our grandparents are looking after their grandchildren, and particularly our grandmothers. And they're the ones with the heavy burden and that responsibility, because the parents of those children are either in jail or they're dead. And it's just a continuous challenge for them to actually meet basic needs on a daily basis.
Colin, Barnett, you're in the state with, I think, Australia's most popular leader. Mark McGowan, as Premier, I think has the highest ratings in the polls of any leader in this country right now. Do you see the same failure of leadership that the folks here on the East Coast are identifying?
Well, look, there has been a lot of squabbling in politics, including Australia, but I still think Australia is advancing as a country. On the COVID situation itself, the first wave, if you like, I think was dealt with well, and Australia was feeling very proud of itself. Then things started to go wrong. The Ruby Princess issue in Sydney, the quarantine failures in Melbourne, and so on. And now, I guess more recently, aged care problems. In Western Australia, Mark McGowan has done a good job, no doubt about it, and the hard border that's been applied here has meant that for most Western Australians, the COVID crisis, and while some restrictions still apply here, life is pretty well getting back to normal. I think the major source of angst that I sense around the community is that the stress that's caused by not being able to reunite families, family members on the East Coast and obviously maybe parents on the West Australian coast can't reunite, and equally going into people overseas who want to return to Australia. But if the attention remains on dealing with the health issue first and foremost, I would hope by Christmas or well before Christmas, most of Australia will be basically back to a normal operation. There'll still be some restrictions, there'll still need to be health measures taken, but we are on track to do that with a bit of luck, as long as we don't get another outbreak like unfortunately happened in Melbourne.
Jillian Broadbent, before we move on, I just want to get an answer to Oliver's question. It was about young people and their perception of where the odds are stacked in Australia and whether the policy settings are right. Before COVID, the Parliamentary Budget Office forecast that boomers as a generation would cost the government $36 billion a year by the year 2028-29. Today, we've had Paul Keating and Kevin Rudd talk about superannuation, saying that this government is trying to destroy the super system. Do you see from even just an economic perspective where young people might be coming from on some of this stuff?
Look, I do see where young people are coming from, but I also think there has been advancement that they're not recognising. And some of it's the openness to accepting, being neutral about gender in male and female opportunities with jobs. But I also see through the university a lot of opportunities for young people who want to start their own businesses that would never occur when I was having a job. So Colin talked about people were in a job for life, or you might have had 2 changes of jobs, and it just happens to be that people change jobs a lot more times, and some of that brings opportunity and enthusiasm rather than being stuck in a job for a long period of time. So the people I see at the university, I mean, I'm very impressed with their capacity to take advantage of. We have an iAccelerator, which is our incubator and accelerator, and it's started 192 companies, employing 800 people. I mean, they're very small, but they're all young people who've just graduated and going into these things. Those support mechanisms were never there even to find a job when you graduated, when I finished. So there are some good things about the more mobile society that we're seeing, but I wondered if I could comment back on this. I have the concern that Kerry has about inequality, but it's been a global dynamic where the returns have gone to capital, not gone to labour.
But how do you change that, Jillian?
Well, that dynamic...
In other words, not change it so that it all goes the other way, but that there is a genuine healthy sharing.
Yeah, that dynamic isn't going to change. What you have to do is a recognition of it, measure the inequalities and have policies that offset it. So I do think the wealth building has to be taxed a bit more heavily than...
But then when you put those policies to the Australian public, like were put at the last election, the public votes against them.
Well, some of that's misrepresentation of the reality of the policies.
OK. So you're talking about things like franking credits?
Absolutely.
Right. So you think something like that is necessary so that a generation like Oliver's doesn't lose out?
Yes.
OK.